Near the city of Harbin in northeastern China, remnants of concrete buildings spread across 6 square kilometers of land. These ruins hold one of history's most terrible secrets. For decades after the Second World War ended, they stood silent, their true purpose hidden beneath official lies and deliberate forgetting. But secrets, even those protected by governments and buried under layers of denial, possess a strange persistence. They leak through cracks in official narratives. They surface in the nightmares of aging perpetrators. They emerge through the determined work of investigators who refuse to let history disappear. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. The story begins with discovery. In the 1980s, a remarkable thing happened. Japanese journalists began following threads of rumor and whispered confession, piecing together fragments of a truth that powerful institutions had worked for decades to suppress. Among them was Yoshinaga Haruko, a reporter for the Akahata newspaper, who spent years tracking down former members of something called Unit 731 men, who had returned to ordinary lives in Japan as university professors, pharmaceutical executives, respected doctors. Some, burdened by decades of silence and approaching death, began to speak. Consider what it takes to break such a silence. These men had carried their secrets for nearly 4 decades, protected by immunity agreements, bound by loyalty oaths, sheltered by governments that preferred forgetting to reckoning. Yet conscience, that persistent force within the human spirit, eventually compelled them to testify. Their confessions revealed the existence of a massive facility disguised as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The name itself was a lie, a bureaucratic euphemism concealing something far darker. No water was purified there. Instead, the complex functioned as a biological warfare research center, where thousands of human beings were subjected to experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. The facility's scale staggers comprehension. Imagine standing at the edge of this complex, trying to absorb its enormity. Over 150 buildings spread across the landscape administrative headquarters, barracks for approximately 3,000 personnel, multiple laboratory blocks, a prison complex designed to hold hundreds of victims at any given time, crematoria to dispose of bodies, and an entire airfield for testing biological weapons delivery. Railroad tracks connected the complex to nearby stations, allowing continuous shipment of prisoners designated for experimentation. The entire operation employed approximately 3,000 people at its peak: doctors, nurses, laboratory technicians, soldiers, administrators, all participating in a system designed to transform human beings into experimental subjects. Think about that number. 3,000 people. Not a handful of monsters acting in isolation, but thousands of ordinary individuals participating in institutionalized horror. This was not the work of a few aberrant minds, but rather an entire ecosystem of complicity, where bureaucratic routine normalized atrocity and professional advancement depended on moral blindness. At the center of this empire of horror stood one man whose story reveals how ambition without ethical constraint can corrupt the noblest of professions. Shiro Ishii was born in 1885 to a wealthy landowning family in Japan. He studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University and joined the Army Medical Corps in 1921. By all accounts, he possessed brilliant scientific intelligence and remarkable charisma qualities that, paired with moral vision, might have saved countless lives. Instead, they enabled mass murder. Ishii's travels to Europe in the 1920s exposed him to Western bacteriology and, paradoxically, to international treaties banning biological weapons. Here was a pivotal moment, a fork in the road of history. Another person might have viewed these prohibitions as ethical boundaries, as humanity's collective recognition that some weapons are too terrible to employ. But Ishii saw them differently. To him, the very fact that nations had banned biological weapons proved they posed such a threat that other powers feared them. Therefore, he reasoned with chilling logic. Japan should develop them in secret. This is how atrocity begins, not with obvious evil but with rationalization. Ishii convinced himself and others that biological weapons offered Japan a strategic advantage against enemies with larger armies and greater industrial capacity. Germs, he argued, could be mass-produced cheaply, deployed invisibly, and could kill enemy soldiers and civilians, while leaving infrastructure intact. The military establishment found his logic compelling. They saw efficiency where others might have seen horror. They saw strategic advantage where ethics demanded restraint. In 1932, they authorized the creation of the Epidemic Prevention Laboratory. By 1936, this had evolved into Unit 731, with Ishii as its commander. The facility's location in Manchuria, the puppet state Japan had created in northeastern China, was strategic. Operating beyond Japan's home islands placed Unit 731 beyond the scrutiny of international observers and Japanese civilians. It created geographic and psychological distance between the crimes and those who might question them. Manchuria provided something else. Ishii needed a steady supply of prisoners. Chinese civilians accused of espionage or resistance, captured soldiers, anyone deemed enemies of the occupation. The victims came from all backgrounds: farmers, teachers, women, children, elderly people, pregnant women. Japanese authorities also sent Korean independence fighters, Russians captured in border conflicts, and even some Japanese citizens accused of political crimes or espionage. To the Unit 731 staff, these human beings became Maruta logs, a term deliberately chosen to erase humanity, to reduce people to raw material for scientific research. Consider the power of language to dehumanize. When you call a human being a log, you create psychological distance from their suffering. You transform murder into data collection, torture into research protocol. This linguistic alchemy allowed doctors trained to heal to instead become agents of systematic harm. The discovery of Unit 731's true nature emerged gradually over decades, like a photograph developing in chemicals, the image growing clearer but no less disturbing with each revelation. American occupation authorities knew immediately after Japan's surrender in 1945. They interrogated Unit 731 leaders and reviewed whatever documentation survived the hasty destruction of evidence. But Cold War calculations led them to grant immunity in exchange for experimental data, a devil's bargain that prioritized strategic advantage over justice. The Soviet Union captured some Unit 731 personnel and conducted the Khabarovsk war crimes trial in 1949, but Western powers dismissed this as propaganda. For decades, official narratives in Japan and the West denied or minimized Unit 731's crimes. Governments that had fought fascism in the name of human dignity became complicit in concealing crimes against humanity. But truth possesses a remarkable resilience. Chinese survivors and victims' families never forgot. They carried memories of family members who disappeared into Unit 731's prison blocks and never returned. These memories persisted through decades of official silence, passed from generation to generation like sacred trust. As China opened to the world in the 1980s, these testimonies began reaching international audiences. Simultaneously, those aging Japanese perpetrators began breaking their silence. Some felt genuine guilt, others sought to ensure their scientific work received recognition even as they approached death. Their confessions, combined with archived documents gradually declassified in the United States and discovered in Japan, built an undeniable historical record. The accumulation of evidence followed patterns we see throughout history when truth confronts power. First comes denial, official statements declaring that nothing happened or that reports are exaggerated. Then comes minimization, acknowledgement that something occurred but downplaying its scope and significance. Then comes selective admission, confirming some facts while disputing others. Finally, sometimes, comes full accounting, though in Unit 731's case, even this remains incomplete. Today, the Unit 731 site near Harbin functions as a museum. The Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731 preserves remaining buildings, including the headquarters structure, portions of the prison complex, and some laboratory facilities. Walking through this space creates a profound confrontation with history. Visitors move through rooms where experiments occurred, view preserved medical instruments, see photographs taken by perpetrators, and read testimonies from survivors. Imagine standing in those rooms. The concrete walls remain, witnesses to what transpired within them. The physical space connects us across time to events that many would prefer to forget. Museums like this serve crucial functions beyond education. They are acts of remembrance, memorials to the thousands who suffered and died there. They stand as physical proof, undeniable and permanent, that these crimes occurred. They prevent the erasure that official denials attempted. The fortress in Manchuria reveals itself slowly to history, each revelation more disturbing than the last. This is a story about the darkest capabilities of human beings and institutions, about the corruption of medicine into murder, and about the long struggle to bring hidden horrors into the light. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, about how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary evil, about how institutions designed to heal can be perverted into instruments of harm. But it is also a story about the persistence of truth, about the courage required to speak difficult truths to power, about survivors who refused to let their suffering disappear into historical silence. It reminds us that bearing witness, however painful, however delayed, serves essential purposes. It honors victims by acknowledging their humanity. It educates present and future generations about the consequences of ethical failure. It strengthens our collective moral immunity against similar atrocities by demonstrating concretely where unconstrained institutions and corrupted professions can lead. Understanding Unit 731 requires examining how it came to exist, what happened within its walls, how its crimes were concealed and gradually exposed, and why many questions remain unanswered even now, 8 decades after the facility ceased operations. This history intersects with broader questions about war, ethics, scientific responsibility, and how societies process difficult histories. It reveals patterns that extend beyond one facility in one war to fundamental questions about human behavior under extreme conditions. The story you are about to hear unfolds across multiple timescales. It begins in the 1920s and 30s, when rapid modernization and militaristic nationalism created conditions for Unit 731's establishment. It continues through the Second World War, when the facility operated at full capacity, conducting experiments that violated every ethical boundary. It extends through the post-war period, when immunity deals and official denials suppressed truth for decades. It reaches into the 1980s and 90s, when investigative journalism and survivor testimony finally brought these crimes into international consciousness. And it connects to our present moment, where Unit 731's legacy influences medical ethics frameworks, biological weapons treaties, and ongoing debates about historical memory and accountability. This is not comfortable history. It does not offer easy lessons or simple conclusions. It confronts us with the reality that medical professionals, people who take oaths to do no harm, can become torturers when institutional pressures, nationalist ideology, and the absence of ethical oversight create conditions for moral collapse. It shows us that knowledge obtained through evil means poses ongoing ethical dilemmas. It demonstrates that justice, when subordinated to strategic interests, may be permanently denied, though truth eventually emerges despite suppression. Yet understanding this history remains essential precisely because it is uncomfortable. The philosopher George Santayana wrote that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Unit 731 represents a limit case, an extreme example of what becomes possible when medicine divorces from ethics, when scientific curiosity operates without moral constraint, when dehumanization becomes institutional policy, and when powerful nations prioritize strategic advantage over accountability. We study this history not to despair about human nature, but to recognize the specific conditions that enable atrocity. We examine these events to identify warning signs, the patterns of dehumanization, the institutional structures that diffuse individual responsibility, the ideological frameworks that justify cruelty, the secrecy that prevents accountability. By understanding how Unit 731 came to exist and operate, we better equip ourselves to recognize and resist similar patterns when they begin emerging in contemporary contexts. The ruins near Harbin stand as monuments to both human capacity for evil and human persistence in seeking truth. They remind us that history's hardest chapters demand our attention not despite but because of their difficulty. They call us to bear witness, to honor victims by ensuring their stories survive, and to commit ourselves to preventing similar atrocities through vigilance, ethical frameworks, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths rather than burying them beneath convenient denial. As we journey deeper into this story, we will trace the historical forces that created Unit 731, examine what occurred within its walls, explore how its crimes were concealed and gradually exposed, and consider what this history teaches us about medicine, ethics, justice, and memory. We will confront specific atrocities in detail not to sensationalize horror, but because bearing witness to what occurred honors the victims and ensures these crimes are never forgotten or denied. We will examine unanswered questions that persist despite decades of investigation, and we will explore Unit 731's ongoing legacy in medical ethics, biological weapons control, and debates about how societies process difficult histories. This is the story of how one of history's most terrible facilities came to exist, operated for years with thousands of participants, and then nearly disappeared from history through deliberate suppression only to re-emerge through the determined work of survivors, investigators, and conscience-driven perpetrators who chose truth over continued concealment. It is a story that connects past to present, revealing that the echoes of Unit 731 still reverberate through contemporary debates about research ethics, biological weapons, and how humanity learns, or fails to learn, from its darkest chapters. The fortress in Manchuria awaits. Its story begins not with the facility itself, but with the historical forces that made it possible with a nation's rapid transformation, with military ambitions unrestrained by ethical limits, and with one man's twisted vision of how medicine could become a weapon of mass destruction. Unit 731 did not emerge from nowhere, springing fully formed into existence like some dark monument to human cruelty. It grew from specific historical forces that converged in Japan during the 1920s and 30s military expansion, rapid modernization, nationalist ideology, and the realization that microorganisms could become weapons of mass destruction. Understanding how a nation's medical establishment transformed from healing to harming requires tracing the pathways by which ethics eroded and atrocity became institutional policy. Japan's transformation from isolated feudal society to industrial power occurred with remarkable speed, a compression of change that in Europe had unfolded across centuries. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 opened Japan to Western technology, ideas, and military organization. Within a single generation, the nation revolutionized itself. Consider the magnitude of this transformation. In 1868, samurai still carried swords, and Japan remained largely agrarian. By the turn of the century, the nation possessed modern factories, railroads, and a military organized along Western lines. The victories came quickly, each one feeding nationalist pride and military confidence. Japan defeated China in the War of 1894 to 1895, claiming Taiwan and establishing dominance over Korea. Then came an even more stunning achievement in 1904 to 1905. Japan defeated Russia, the first time in the modern era that an Asian power had defeated a European one. Imagine the psychological impact of this victory. Japan had proven that adopting Western military technology and organization enabled a smaller nation to compete with and defeat larger powers. But rapid modernization created tensions beneath the surface. Traditional Japanese values emphasizing honor, loyalty, and hierarchy merged uneasily with Western scientific rationalism and industrial capitalism. The military gained enormous political influence, viewing itself not merely as the nation's defense force, but as the embodiment of national spirit, the instrument of Japan's destiny as an Asian empire. This ideology of military expansion combined with growing population pressure and limited natural resources on the home islands, drove Japan to seek colonial territories. Korea became a protectorate in 1905, then a full colony in 1910. Japan seized German possessions in China during the First World War. Each success established patterns of expansion that would intensify in the 1930s, patterns that included not just territorial acquisition, but the systematic exploitation and brutalization of occupied populations. The seeds of Unit 731 were planted in this soil in military dominance unchecked by ethical restraint, in nationalist ideology that ranked some peoples as inferior, in the belief that Japan's destiny justified any means. The 1920s brought both progress and crisis. Japan participated in international disarmament conferences, joining the community of nations in establishing rules for warfare. In 1925, Japan signed the Geneva Protocol, which prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. Yet, observe the paradox here. Many Japanese military strategists secretly viewed this treaty not as a moral prohibition, but as confirmation that such weapons were effective enough to require banning. If nations feared biological weapons so much they agreed to prohibit them, then clearly these weapons possessed devastating power. Shiro Ishii was among those who drew this conclusion. During his travel to Europe from 1928 to 1930, he studied bacteriology, visited medical research institutions, and learned about Western biological warfare research, much of it theoretical or defensive in nature, focused on protecting populations from disease rather than weaponizing pathogens. But Ishii recognized that the same knowledge used to defend against biological attacks could be weaponized. The line between defensive and offensive research proved disturbingly thin. Think about the moment Ishii returned to Japan, convinced that biological weapons offered a solution to his nation's strategic challenges. Japan lacked the industrial capacity of the United States or Soviet Union. Oil, steel, and other resources needed for conventional warfare had to be imported, creating vulnerabilities in any extended conflict. But biological weapons could be produced relatively cheaply using basic laboratory equipment. Bacteria and viruses replicated themselves exponential growth from small initial cultures. A single laboratory could potentially produce enough pathogens to sicken or kill millions. Moreover, biological attacks offered strategic advantages that conventional weapons could not. They could be delivered covertly, before war was officially declared, potentially crippling an enemy before fighting began. They were invisible weapons that spread through natural transmission, making attribution difficult. They killed people while leaving infrastructure intact, buildings, factories, resources that could be seized by occupying forces. To a military mind unconstrained by ethical considerations, biological weapons appeared nearly ideal. Ishii's proposals found receptive audiences among military commanders frustrated by international arms limitations and seeking asymmetric advantages. In 1932, the Kwantung Army, Japan's force occupying Manchuria, authorized creation of the Epidemic Prevention Laboratory. Ishii received funding, personnel, and most importantly, permission to conduct research using human subjects. The initial facility, known as the Zhongma Fortress, operated from 1932 to 1937 in Beiyinhe, about 100 kilometers south of Harbin. This early installation established protocols and methodologies that Unit 731 would later expand. It was here that the fundamental moral boundary was first crossed: the decision to use human beings as experimental subjects without consent, without any pretense of medical benefit to the subjects themselves. Once this boundary was crossed, subsequent atrocities became incremental steps rather than radical departures. When local Chinese resistance made the Zhongma location vulnerable, the entire operation moved to a new, larger facility near Harbin, officially designated as Unit 731 inches 1936. The biological weapons program expanded rapidly, metastasizing across occupied territories like the very diseases it studied. Unit 731 became the flagship of a network that included Unit 100, which focused on agricultural biological warfare, killing livestock and destroying crops to create famine and economic collapse. Smaller satellite units spread throughout Japanese-occupied territory in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. At its peak, this biological warfare network involved thousands of personnel across dozens of facilities, all working toward the same dark purpose. The program received substantial funding from the military budget and support from Japan's pharmaceutical industry, which provided equipment and technical expertise. This corporate involvement raises troubling questions about complicity. Did pharmaceutical companies know their products and expertise were being used for human experimentation? Did they profit from Unit 731's research? These questions remain partially unanswered, obscured by destroyed records and corporate silence. The microorganisms weaponized by Unit 731 included some of history's deadliest diseases. Plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, had killed millions during historical pandemics. The Black Death that devastated medieval Europe originated from this pathogen. Unit 731 researchers recognized that plague could be transmitted through infected fleas or aerosol spray, making it adaptable to different delivery methods. Cholera, caused by Vibrio cholerae, spread through contaminated water and could sicken entire populations, creating infrastructure collapse as medical systems became overwhelmed. Anthrax spores remained viable for decades, in soil a persistent threat that could deny territory to enemies long after initial deployment. The spores killed rapidly when inhaled, attacking the respiratory system with brutal efficiency. Typhoid, glanders, dysentery, each disease offered different characteristics useful for specific military objectives. Some killed quickly, others incapacitated slowly, straining enemy medical resources. Some spread easily through populations. Others remained contained to initial victims. Unit 731 researchers cultivated these pathogens in massive quantities, studied their transmission characteristics, developed delivery mechanisms, and tested their effects on human subjects. The weapons delivery systems they developed showed terrible ingenuity. Ceramic bombs were designed to shatter on impact and release plague-infected fleas that would then seek human hosts, spreading disease through natural transmission. Spray tanks for aircraft could disperse liquid bacterial cultures over wide areas, creating aerosol infections. Contamination of water supplies with cholera or typhoid bacteria could sicken entire cities. Each system was tested, refined, and tested again. Field tests occurred in Chinese villages and cities, though the full extent of biological weapons deployment remains disputed to this day. Evidence suggests plague-infected fleas were released over Ningbo in 1940, causing an outbreak that killed hundreds. Similar attacks may have occurred in other locations, with disease outbreaks attributed to natural causes, masking deliberate biological warfare. The ambiguity itself reveals something troubling. We may never know the full extent of these crimes, because disease outbreaks during wartime were common, and distinguishing between natural epidemics and deliberate attacks requires documentation that was either never created or was destroyed. The expansion of biological warfare research required constant supplies of human subjects for experiments. This demand drove a system of arrest, imprisonment, and murder that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. Military police and special units arrested Chinese civilians on minimal or fabricated charges, espionage, resistance activities, anti-Japanese sentiment. The accusations often mattered less than the need to maintain supply chains. Unit 731 consumed human beings like a factory consumes raw materials. The facility processed prisoners through stages that transformed them from individuals into experimental subjects. Intake stripped of possessions and identity. Documentation assigned numbers instead of names. Quarantine ensuring subjects were disease-free before experiments began, because infected subjects produced unreliable data. Then, allocation to specific research projects based on age, sex, health status. Few prisoners survived more than a few months. Most died from experimental infections, were killed during vivisections, or were executed when they became too sick or weak to provide useful data. The transformation of medicine into murder required systematic dehumanization. Unit 7 31 staff underwent indoctrination, emphasizing that prisoners were enemies of Japan, less than human, that their deaths served the greater good of protecting Japanese soldiers and ensuring national survival. New personnel started with minor tasks, feeding prisoners, cleaning laboratories, and gradually progressed to direct participation in experiments. This incremental involvement allowed individuals to adjust to each level of moral transgression before moving to the next, like descending stairs into darkness, one step at a time. Social conformity pressures reinforced participation. Refusing orders or expressing doubt marked one as unpatriotic or weak, potentially ending military careers or worse. The hierarchical military structure meant that orders came from superiors, and questioning them violated fundamental military discipline. Individual moral responsibility became diffused across organizational layers. The doctor conducting experiments could claim he was following orders. The commanding officer could claim he was implementing policy. The policymaker could claim he was serving national security. Everyone was responsible, which meant no one felt fully responsible. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 operated as a fully functional biological warfare research and production facility. Its personnel had conducted thousands of experiments, accumulated data on disease transmission and effects, developed weapons delivery systems, and produced biological agents in quantities sufficient for military deployment. The facility represented the culmination of a process by which a nation's scientific and medical establishments had been corrupted into instruments of mass murder. Consider what this reveals about institutions. Unit 731 was not the work of a few deranged individuals, but rather a large-scale operation requiring bureaucratic coordination, sustained funding, personnel recruitment and training, supply chain management, and integration with broader military strategy. Thousands of people participated at various levels. Atrocity had become institutionalized, routinized, normalized. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson, that systematic evil does not require monsters. It requires only ordinary people placed in institutional contexts where ethical constraints have been removed and where participation in horror becomes a matter of professional duty. The rise of biological warfare in Japan demonstrates how medical science, which should serve healing and human welfare, can be perverted into instruments of mass death when divorced from ethical oversight and placed in service of militaristic nationalism. It shows how international agreements meant to prevent atrocities can paradoxically inspire them when nations view treaties as proof of effectiveness rather than as moral boundaries. It reveals how dehumanizing language and ideology create psychological distance that enables ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. Understanding this history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of ethical norms and the ease with which institutions can normalize atrocity. The pathways by which Japan developed biological weapons were not unique to that nation or that era. They represent patterns that can emerge anywhere when specific conditions align: military ambition unrestrained by ethics, nationalist ideology that dehumanizes others, institutional structures that diffuse individual moral responsibility, and secrecy that prevents accountability. The fortress in Manchuria stood ready. Its laboratories were equipped, its personnel were trained, its supply of human subjects was assured. What happened next, inside those concrete walls, would demonstrate the depths to which medicine could sink when completely severed from its healing purpose. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 represent systematic violations of human dignity, medical ethics, and the most basic moral principles. To understand this history requires confronting specific atrocities in detail, not to sensationalize horror, but because bearing witness to what occurred honors the victims and ensures these crimes are never forgotten or denied. What follows draws from testimonies of survivors, confessions of perpetrators, documents that escaped destruction, and investigations, conducted over decades by historians and journalists. Prisoners arrived at Unit 731 by rail, transported from detention facilities across Manchuria and beyond in boxcars that offered no comfort, no explanation of their destination. Upon arrival, guards stripped them of personal belongings and clothing, replacing their garments with simple prison uniforms. Each prisoner received a number. From that moment, Unit 731 staff rarely used names. The dehumanizing term maruta, meaning logs, reduced human beings to laboratory materials, to objects without consciousness or dignity. The prison complex, designated Building 7, contained approximately 400 cells. Individual cells measured roughly 2 meters by 3 meters spaces, barely large enough to lie down in, basic sleeping platforms and minimal sanitation. Guards delivered food through slots in metal doors. Prisoners lived in isolation, without knowledge of what awaited them or why they had been imprisoned. Imagine the psychological torment of this uncertainty. Trapped in a cell with no information, hearing sounds from other parts of the facility, footsteps, doors opening and closing, sometimes screams. The selection of subjects for specific experiments followed the requirements of ongoing research projects. Doctors reviewed prisoner records, noting age, sex, health status, and ethnic background. Researchers selecting subjects for frostbite experiments preferred healthy young men whose physical responses would provide clear data. Studies on disease transmission in pregnant women required female prisoners at specific stages of pregnancy. Children were subjected to experiments examining disease progression in developing bodies. The selection process transformed human diversity into experimental variables, treating individual characteristics not as expressions of unique personhood, but as parameters to control or manipulate. Frostbite experiments aimed to determine the most effective treatments for soldiers fighting in Manchuria's brutal winters, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius cold that could kill exposed flesh in minutes. But rather than testing treatments using ethical methods, Unit 731 researchers deliberately inflicted frostbite on prisoners. Guards forced subjects to stand outdoors in freezing weather with limbs exposed. Some testimonies describe prisoners held outside until their fingers froze solid, tissue crystallizing as water within cells turned to ice. Researchers struck frozen limbs with sticks to test tissue hardness, treating human arms and legs like specimens in a materials science experiment. Once severe frostbite was established, researchers tested various treatments: rapid rewarming in hot water, slow thawing at room temperature, amputation at different points, different medications, observing which approaches best preserved tissue function. Subjects endured this process repeatedly. Those who survived one round of frostbite experiments had other limbs frozen in subsequent tests. Few subjects survived more than a few repetitions before dying from complications, infection, shock, organ failure. Vivisection surgery on living subjects without anesthesia occurred routinely in Unit 731's laboratories. These procedures served multiple purposes in the researchers' minds. They wanted to observe infected organs while subjects were alive, before death altered tissue characteristics. They wanted to examine blood flow, organ function, and the body's responses to infection in ways that autopsy could not reveal. Testimonies describe subjects strapped to operating tables, fully conscious, as doctors made incisions, removed organs for examination, and extracted tissue samples. Consider what this means. A human being, aware and feeling everything, watching as doctors, people who had taken oaths to heal, cut into their body without anesthesia, removing organs while explaining observations to assistants taking notes. Some vivisections focused on determining how long humans could survive with specific organs removed. Others tested surgical techniques without any concern for subject survival. The screams of victims during these procedures haunted some perpetrators for decades, eventually contributing to confessions that exposed Unit 731's crimes. But in the moment, those screams were simply background noise in laboratories where human suffering had become routine. Pressure chamber experiments tested human physiological limits using equipment that could simulate extreme altitude or deep-sea pressure. Unit 731 maintained pressure chambers where subjects experienced rapid decompression, creating conditions similar to explosive decompression at high altitude. The results were predictable and horrific. Organs ruptured as pressure differentials tore tissue. Blood vessels burst, eyes dislocated from their sockets. Researchers carefully documented the progression of symptoms, the timeline of organ failure, and the threshold pressures at which death occurred. The scientific value of this data remains questionable. The experimental conditions, sudden, extreme pressure changes on unprepared, terrified subjects, differed fundamentally from real-world scenarios the military sought to understand. Pilots who lost cabin pressure at high altitude would be wearing protective equipment and might have time to respond. The Unit 731 experiments removed all variables except pressure change itself, producing data that, even setting aside the moral horror, was methodologically flawed. Infection experiments represented the core of Unit 731's biological warfare research. Researchers deliberately infected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and other diseases using various delivery methods. Some subjects received infected food or water. Others were exposed to aerosol sprays containing bacteria, forced to breathe air laden with pathogens. Plague experiments often involved exposing subjects to fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, testing whether flea-based delivery systems could effectively transmit disease. Researchers documented everything: incubation periods, symptom progression, mortality rates, time from infection to death. They measured fever curves, catalogued symptoms, photographed disease progression. Some experiments tested disease transmission between humans by housing infected and uninfected subjects together, observing how contagion spread through proximity. Others examined whether specific treatments or vaccines provided protection, though these treatment trials merely tested whether interventions slowed disease progression rather than actually attempting to cure subjects. Throughout these experiments, no subject received genuine medical care aimed at their survival. Researchers ultimately allowed all subjects to die so autopsies could examine the disease's full effects on tissues and organs. The progression from infection to death became mapped with clinical precision, each stage documented, each symptom recorded. The human reality, fever, pain, terror, awareness of approaching death, was translated into data points and observations. Women faced particular horrors at Unit 731. Pregnant prisoners underwent forced infections to study disease transmission to fetuses and disease effects on pregnancy outcomes. Some testimonies describe forced pregnancies resulting from rape by guards or staff, followed by experimental infections at various stages of gestation. Researchers wanted to understand whether diseases crossed the placental barrier, whether they caused miscarriage or birth defects, whether newborns were infected. Other experiments tested the effects of various pathogens on reproductive organs, deliberately infecting women and then conducting examinations or vivisections. Women who survived these experiments faced permanent physical damage and psychological trauma that lasted lifetimes. Some became unable to bear children due to damage from infections or procedures. Others lived with chronic pain from injuries that never properly healed. All carried memories of violations so profound that many never spoke of them, carrying their trauma in silence until death. Children were not exempted from Unit 731's experiments. Personnel imprisoned entire families, and researchers infected children with diseases to study how pathogens affected developing immune systems. Some experiments deliberately infected children of different ages to observe whether they showed different symptom progression or mortality rates compared to adults. The presence of children at Unit 731 reveals the complete absence of any ethical boundaries that would have protected the most vulnerable. When even children become acceptable experimental subjects, every moral limit has been transgressed. Weapons field tests occurred on outdoor proving grounds, where researchers tested biological weapons delivery systems under realistic conditions. Some experiments involved tying prisoners to stakes at various distances from explosive devices designed to disperse bacteria in aerosol form. Researchers documented infection rates at different distances and exposure levels, determining effective ranges for weapons deployment. Other field tests dropped biological bombs from aircraft, releasing plague-infected fleas over contained areas where prisoners were exposed to the falling clouds of insects. These outdoor experiments produced data on weapons' effectiveness that laboratory studies could not provide. but they required executing any test subjects who survived to prevent disease spread beyond the facility and maintain secrecy. The bodies were burned in crematoria that operated continuously, reducing flesh and bone to ash, erasing the physical evidence of lives destroyed. The documentation of experiments followed scientific protocols, detailed observation notes, measurements, photographs, and tissue samples preserved for later study. This documentation served two purposes. First, it generated the data. Unit 731 was created to produce, creating records that could inform military biological warfare strategy. Second, it normalized atrocity by framing murder as research and suffering as experimental observations. The scientific language and methodical record-keeping created psychological distance between the human reality of torture and the abstract language of data collection. Researchers could write in reports, subject number 317 showed typical symptom progression, without confronting that subject was a human being dying in agony, perhaps a farmer who had been arrested on false charges, perhaps a teacher, perhaps someone's father or mother or child. The numbered system, the clinical language, the standardized forms, all of this bureaucratic apparatus served to obscure the fundamental truth that these were people being tortured to death. Some Unit 731 personnel later claimed they believed subjects would be executed anyway, so using them for experiments served a practical purpose. Why waste lives that were already forfeit? This rationalization ignores that Unit 731's demand for subjects drove arrests and condemnations. The facility's existence created the supply of prisoners it consumed. Others claimed they were following orders and would face punishment for refusal. While military hierarchy certainly pressured compliance, evidence shows that some personnel requested transfers or found ways to minimize their involvement without facing severe consequences. The majority participated willingly, driven by combinations of nationalist ideology, the belief that they served Japan's vital interests, scientific curiosity untethered from ethical constraint. Careerism participation in Unit 731 could advance military medical careers, and the gradual moral numbing that occurs when institutions normalize atrocity. Humans adapt to circumstances, and when those circumstances include daily exposure to suffering and death, adaptation can mean the erosion of empathy and moral sensitivity. The total number of people who died at Unit 731 remains uncertain, a statistical ambiguity that itself troubles us. Conservative estimates suggest at least 3,000 deaths occurred within the main facility, with potentially thousands more at satellite units. Some historians argue the true toll reached 10,000 or more, accounting for deaths from field weapons tests and subjects who died during transport. Accurate accounting proves impossible because Unit 731 personnel destroyed most records before surrendering, and many deaths occurred outside the main facility in circumstances that complicate attribution. But consider what this uncertainty means. We cannot even count the victims with precision. Their names, their stories, their individual identities. Most of this has been lost, destroyed by perpetrators, seeking to conceal their crimes, or simply lost to time and bureaucratic erasure. What remains certain is that thousands of human beings, people with names, families, dreams, and inherent dignity, suffered horrific deaths in experiments that violated their bodies, erased their humanity, and treated their suffering as scientific data. No abstract discussion of military strategy, scientific knowledge, or historical context diminishes the fundamental moral truth that Unit 731 represented medicine perverted into torture and human beings reduced to laboratory materials. Understanding what occurred requires confronting these realities directly, refusing the sanitizing distance of euphemism, and recognizing that these crimes were committed by ordinary people who chose, in circumstances that did allow moral choice, to participate in evil. The laboratories of death revealed something profound and disturbing about human nature and institutional behavior. They showed that healing professions can be corrupted, that scientific curiosity without ethical constraint becomes monstrous, that bureaucratic systems can normalize atrocity through routine and language, and that ordinary people, given certain conditions and institutional contexts, can participate in systematic horror. This is uncomfortable knowledge. We would prefer to believe that such crimes require monsters fundamentally different from ourselves. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The doctors at Unit 731 were not born evil. They were trained in medicine, had families, enjoyed art and literature, were capable of kindness in some contexts. What they did at Unit 731 resulted not from inherent monstrosity, but from a combination of ideology, institutional pressures, moral numbness, and the human capacity to rationalize and compartmentalize. Understanding this makes Unit 731's lessons more urgent, not less. If ordinary people can become perpetrators under certain conditions, then all of us must remain vigilant about the conditions we create and participate in. We must question institutions that ask us to dehumanize others. We must resist ideologies that rank some lives as less valuable. We must maintain ethical constraints on scientific research. We must refuse the language and logic of rationalization that frames atrocity as necessity. The experiments ended when Japan surrendered in August 1945. But the knowledge gained and the patterns established would have consequences extending far beyond the facility's closure. What happened next? The immunity deals? The cover-ups? The years of silence would demonstrate that evil's legacy persists long after evil acts conclude. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Unit 731 personnel faced a crisis. The war was over. The Kwantung Army, which had protected and funded their operations, was dissolved. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through Manchuria, and Chinese resistance forces controlled much of the countryside. Within days, Shiro, Ishii ordered the destruction of evidence. Unit 731 personnel dynamited buildings, burned documents, killed remaining prisoners to eliminate witnesses, and prepared for evacuation. The destruction of evidence was systematic but incomplete. Staff burned research notes, experimental records, and personnel files. Decades of accumulated data, feeding flames while perpetrators watched their crimes literally turn to ash. They destroyed laboratory equipment that would reveal the facility's true purpose. Crematoria worked continuously, reducing bodies and body parts to ash, eliminating the physical evidence of thousands of murders. Some buildings were demolished to hide their function, explosions echoing across the Manchurian landscape as Unit 731 attempted to erase itself from history. But complete destruction proved impossible. The facility's size, the short time available, and the approach of Soviet forces prevented total erasure. Some documents survived, hidden in haste or overlooked in the chaos of evacuation. The physical structures remained, though damaged concrete walls that would stand as witnesses for decades. Most significantly, the knowledge Unit 731 had accumulated resided in the minds of surviving personnel, and this knowledge interested the American occupation authorities greatly. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied powers occupying Japan, learned of Unit 731's existence through initial interrogations of captured Japanese military leaders. As details emerged, human experiments, biological weapons, systematic atrocities, American military intelligence faced a decision that would reveal the moral compromises that power often entails. They recognized that Unit 731's biological warfare research represented potentially valuable information. The United States was entering the Cold War, transitioning from wartime alliance with the Soviet Union to adversarial competition. American strategists believed the Soviets might pursue biological weapons, creating threats that the United States needed to understand and counter. Unit 731's data, obtained through experiments that American ethics would never permit, offered insights into biological warfare that couldn't be gained any other way. This was the rationalization. American researchers could not conduct human experiments on infectious diseases. Ethical constraints prevented it. But Japanese researchers had conducted such experiments, accumulating data about human responses to pathogens, about weapons delivery effectiveness, about disease progression under controlled conditions. If that data existed, American military strategists argued, shouldn't it be secured and analyzed rather than lost or, worse, obtained exclusively by the Soviets? American interrogators contacted Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders through intermediaries. Initial conversations occurred in autumn 1945, months after Japan's surrender. The Americans made their interest clear. They wanted complete disclosure of Unit 731's research, including experimental methodologies, results, and technical knowledge about biological weapons, production, and deployment. In exchange, the Americans offered something Unit 731 personnel desperately wanted: immunity from war crimes prosecution. Think about this moment. Imagine being in those rooms where negotiations occurred. On one side, American military intelligence officers, representing a nation that had just fought a war, justified partly as a defense of human rights and international law. On the other side, Japanese researchers who had conducted systematic human experimentation, tortured thousands to death, developed weapons of mass destruction, and between them, a deal taking shape: immunity in exchange for information, strategic advantage in exchange for justice foregone. The negotiations unfolded over months. American investigators, led by Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders and later by Lieutenant Colonel Arvo Thompson, conducted extensive interviews with Ishii and his subordinates. The Japanese participants initially minimized the scope of their work, claiming Unit 731 focused on defensive research, studying diseases to protect Japanese soldiers, not weaponizing pathogens for offensive use. This was a calculated negotiating strategy, testing how much Americans actually knew. But as interrogations continued and Americans demonstrated they possessed significant evidence of Unit 731's true activities, the Japanese negotiators adjusted their strategy. They acknowledged human experiments had occurred, but emphasized the scientific value of the data obtained. They presented themselves not as war criminals, but as scientists who had made difficult choices in wartime, who possessed unique knowledge that could serve American interests. The framing mattered. By emphasizing scientific value and strategic utility, they transformed their crimes from moral outrages into valuable intelligence assets. The American position evolved as the Cold War intensified. By 1947, tensions between the United States and Soviet Union had escalated dramatically. The wartime alliance had collapsed. Soviet biological warfare capabilities remained unknown, creating anxiety among American military planners. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviets had captured some Unit 731 personnel and might exploit their knowledge. This possibility added urgency to American efforts to secure Unit 731's research before the Soviets gained exclusive access. The strategic calculation tilted decisively. The intelligence value of Unit 731's data outweighed the symbolic and moral value of prosecuting its creators. This was not a calculation made lightly or without awareness of its moral dimensions. American officials understood they were granting immunity to war criminals, but they believed or convinced themselves that strategic necessity justified this compromise. In the emerging Cold War, with the prospect of nuclear weapons and potentially biological weapons threatening American security, obtaining every possible advantage seemed paramount. The deal took final shape in 1948. In exchange for complete disclosure of experimental data, protocols, and technical knowledge, the United States agreed not to prosecute Unit 731 personnel as war criminals, and not to share information about their activities with other Allied powers, particularly the Soviet Union. The agreement explicitly excluded Unit 731 from the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Trials, which were prosecuting Japanese military leaders for various war crimes. Consider the injustice of this arrangement. While these tribunals hanged leaders responsible for atrocities across Asia, commanders who ordered massacres, officials who authorized torture, administrators who organized forced labor, Unit 731's personnel returned to civilian life in Japan, protected by America's guarantee of immunity. The disparity revealed a troubling principle, that justice could be selective, that accountability could be negotiated, that crimes against humanity might be forgiven if perpetrators possessed valuable information. The data exchange occurred through multiple channels. American investigators received written reports summarizing Unit 731's research in various areas: plague transmission, frostbite treatment, disease progression, timelines, weapons, delivery effectiveness, and other topics. The reports totaled approximately 10,000 pages of technical information, a massive transfer of knowledge accumulated through systematic human experimentation. Beyond written reports, American investigators conducted extensive interviews, recording Unit 731 personnel, explaining their experimental methodologies and results in detail. Some American biological warfare researchers traveled to Japan specifically to interview Unit 731 veterans about technical details, essentially conducting debriefings with war criminals while treating them as expert consultants. The information flowed to Fort Detrick in Maryland, headquarters of the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, where it informed American biological warfare research programs. What specific knowledge was incorporated? How it influenced American research? These questions remain partially obscured by classification that persists even now. The scientific value of Unit 731's data remains contested. Some analysts argue the information provided genuine insights, particularly regarding human responses to specific pathogens and the effectiveness of various weapons delivery systems, knowledge that could not be obtained through ethical research methods or animal studies. Others contend that Unit 731's research was methodologically flawed, conducted on malnourished, terrified, imprisoned subjects under conditions vastly different from battlefield scenarios, producing results of questionable applicability. Many experiments lacked proper controls. Documentation was incomplete, destroyed during the evacuation, or never thoroughly maintained in the first place. The ethical violations that enabled the research also compromised its scientific validity. Stressed, starving, terrified subjects do not respond to pathogens the same way healthy, well-nourished individuals would. Critics of the immunity deal argue that the United States traded justice for data of limited actual value, making a moral compromise that yielded little practical benefit. While Americans granted immunity and concealed Unit 731's crimes, the Soviet Union took a different approach, though whether from moral principle or strategic opportunism remains debatable. Soviet forces had captured some Unit 731 personnel during their rapid advance through Manchuria. In December 1949, the Soviets conducted the Khabarovsk war crimes trial, prosecuting 12 Unit 731 members for war crimes, including developing biological weapons and conducting human experiments. The trial lasted 5 days. Defendants testified about Unit 731's structure, operations, and experiments in sessions that were recorded and transcribed. The tribunal sentenced the defendants to prison terms ranging from 2 to 25 years punishment, though hardly proportional to their crimes. The Soviet Union publicized the trial internationally, distributing translations of testimony and findings, using the trial both to expose Japanese atrocities and to embarrass the United States and its newly ally in the Cold War. Western powers dismissed the Khabarovsk trials as Soviet propaganda aimed at embarrassing Japan and the United States. American and British governments claimed the trial lacked credibility because defendants had been in Soviet custody for years and may have been coerced into testimony. The Western press gave the trials minimal coverage, and the testimonies presented were largely ignored. Outside the Soviet sphere, this dismissal proved convenient for both the United States, which had granted immunity to Unit 731 leaders, and for Japan, which preferred to suppress knowledge of Unit 731's existence. The immunity deal's consequences extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Shiro Ishii returned to Tokyo, where he lived comfortably until his death in 1959 at age 67, 14 years of peaceful life after the war's end. He faced no prosecution, gave no public accounting of his crimes, maintained relationships with former subordinates and Japanese military establishment figures. He died of throat cancer, a natural death in his own bed, surrounded by family. Consider the injustice: thousands died in his laboratories through deliberate infection and torture, while he lived out his years in comfort. Other Unit 731 leaders resumed professional careers with ease. Several became university professors, teaching medicine and microbiology to new generations of students who had no idea of their professors' pasts. Others joined pharmaceutical companies, rising to executive positions where they influenced drug development and corporate policy. Some opened private medical practices, treating patients while carrying memories of those they had tortured. A few entered politics, gaining influence over public health policy. The immunity granted by the United States enabled war criminals to live prosperous, respected lives, their crimes concealed behind reconstructed biographies. This outcome created lasting bitterness among victims' families and Chinese citizens. For decades, the Chinese government protested Japan's failure to acknowledge Unit 731's crimes and compensate victims. These protests were ignored or dismissed by Japanese authorities and largely unreported in Western media. The cover-up persisted because it served multiple interests. Japanese officials preferred not to confront this shameful history. American authorities wanted to conceal their role in granting immunity, and Cold War dynamics made close US-Japan relations a strategic priority that might be complicated by demands for historical accounting. Not until the 1980s, when investigative journalists began publishing detailed exposés, did international awareness of Unit 731 begin to grow. Even then, the American role in granting immunity and concealing Unit 731's activities emerged slowly, revealed through declassified documents and historical research conducted decades after the events. Each revelation demonstrated how thoroughly the cover-up had succeeded, how completely official narratives had suppressed truth. The immunity deal represents a profound moral failure by the United States. Strategic calculations and Cold War anxieties led American leaders to prioritize intelligence gathering over justice. They became complicit in covering up crimes against humanity, enabling perpetrators to escape accountability, and denying victims recognition of their suffering. The rationalization that obtaining Unit 731's data served American national security interests required treating justice as negotiable and human rights as secondary to strategic advantage. This decision established a troubling precedent that pragmatic interests could override moral principles, even in cases of clear atrocity. It demonstrated that a nation could fight a war justified partly by moral outrage at enemy crimes, then grant immunity to some of those same criminals when doing so served perceived strategic interests. The hypocrisy was profound, prosecuting some war criminals while protecting others based not on the severity of their crimes but on their utility to American interests. The full extent of what America learned from Unit 731 remains partially classified. Some documents have been released through Freedom of Information Act requests and declassification reviews conducted over decades. Others remain withheld on national security grounds, a classification that, 75 years after Japan's surrender, perpetuates the cover-up. It prevents complete historical accounting and suggests that some information obtained from Unit 731 continues to be considered sensitive, though what specific knowledge warrants continued classification remains unexplained. The immunity deal for Unit 731 parallels other post-war decisions, where victorious powers granted leniency to defeated enemies in exchange for scientific or intelligence information. Nazi scientists who developed rocket technology were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, their pasts overlooked or minimized to exploit their technical knowledge. Soviet intelligence services similarly recruited German scientists. These precedents established patterns where expertise and information were valued above accountability for crimes, with consequences that continue shaping debates about justice, security, and moral compromise in international relations. The immunity deal's legacy raises fundamental questions about justice, accountability, and the moral compromises nations make in pursuit of strategic advantage. Can justice be negotiated? Should crimes against humanity be forgiven if perpetrators possess valuable information? Does strategic necessity justify moral compromise? These questions have no easy answers, But Unit 731's case suggests that the costs of such compromises extend far beyond the immediate transaction. They undermine faith in international law, damage the moral standing of nations that make them, and deny victims the recognition and restitution they deserve. The deal with Unit 731 was not inevitable. American officials made choices, calculated benefits and costs, and decided that strategic advantage outweighed justice. They could have chosen differently. They could have prosecuted Unit 731 personnel while still obtaining their data through interrogations before trial. They could have insisted on public accounting as the price of leniency. They chose instead to grant complete immunity in exchange for secrecy, to protect war criminals while concealing their crimes. That choice continues reverberating through history, a reminder that moral failures, especially those committed by powerful nations, cast long shadows. For decades, silence surrounded Unit 731, like a protective barrier maintained by multiple forces. The American immunity deal suppressed information. The Japanese government denied the facility's existence or minimized its activities. Perpetrators maintained coordinated silence, protected by immunity guarantees and social pressure against revealing shameful wartime activities. But truth, however deeply buried, possesses persistent vitality, like seeds that remain dormant in soil for years, waiting for conditions that allow germination. Survivors carried memories. Families mourned disappeared relatives. Journalists followed rumors. Aging perpetrators felt guilt's weight, pressing heavier as death approached. Gradually, voices emerged from the shadows, speaking truths that power structures had worked to suppress. This emergence was not sudden revelation but gradual accumulation testimony, building on testimony, document discovered after document, confession following confession, until the weight of evidence became undeniable. The first cracks in the wall of silence appeared in China. Survivors of Unit 731, those rare individuals who had been imprisoned there but escaped or were released before execution, lived with memories of horrors they struggled to articulate. Some had been imprisoned briefly and released due to administrative errors or facility overcrowding, bureaucratic mistakes that inadvertently saved lives. Others had worked as forced laborers in support roles and witnessed experiments without being subjected to them, seeing horrors while somehow surviving. For years after the war, these survivors kept silent, traumatized by what they had experienced and witnessed, uncertain whom to tell, aware that speaking about Unit 731 meant reliving nightmare experiences. But as China opened internationally in the 1970s and 80s, some survivors found audiences willing to listen. One of the most significant testimonies came from a man named Han Xiao, who had been imprisoned at Unit 731 as a teenager accused of anti-Japanese activities. Han witnessed experiments, heard screams from adjacent cells, and survived because Soviet forces liberated the area before he could be killed, timing that represented the difference between death and survival. His testimony, published in Chinese newspapers in the 1980s, provided detailed physical descriptions of the facility's interior, the layout of cell blocks, the appearance of laboratories, the routines of guards and doctors. These details corroborated architectural evidence and photographs that investigators had uncovered, lending credibility to accounts that skeptics had dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda. Other Chinese survivors came forward with similar stories, each adding pieces to an emerging mosaic of truth. Wang Zi, a woman imprisoned at Unit 731, testified about being subjected to forced infections and witnessing the deaths of other women prisoners. Her account included specific names of doctors she remembered, names that matched personnel records that had survived, and descriptions of experimental procedures that matched details from perpetrator confessions. These survivor testimonies were crucial because they provided victim perspectives that perpetrators' accounts often minimized or distorted. While perpetrators might frame experiments in clinical language, emphasizing scientific protocols, survivors described the human reality, the fear of hearing footsteps approaching your cell, knowing you might be selected for experiments, the pain of infections taking hold in your body, the horror of watching others sicken and die, the dehumanizing treatment that reduced you to a number and a specimen. This contrast between clinical description and lived experience revealed how language itself could become an instrument of denial, how calling torture research could obscure the reality of human suffering. Parallel to survivor testimonies, investigative journalists in Japan began pursuing rumors of Unit 731's existence with determination that would ultimately crack open decades of official denial. Yoshinaga Haruko's work for the Akahata newspaper became particularly significant. Through years of painstaking research, she identified former Unit 731 personnel, a detective process requiring cross-referencing military records, tracking career paths of Japanese doctors who had worked in Manchuria during the war, following leads from one interview to the next. She persuaded some to speak, a remarkable achievement given the social and legal protections these men enjoyed. Her approach combined persistent investigation with empathy, recognizing that some perpetrators felt genuine remorse and might share information if approached respectfully rather than accusatorially. This strategy yielded results. Some former Unit 731 members, facing their mortality and burdened by decades of concealment, chose to confess. One of the first Japanese perpetrators to break silence was Shinozuka Yoshio, who had worked at Unit 731 as a Youth Corps member in the early 1940s. After the war, Shinozuka lived quietly in Japan, haunted by what he had witnessed and participated in. By the 1980s, elderly and increasingly troubled by memories, he began speaking publicly about Unit 731. His testimony was particularly powerful because he acknowledged his own complicity rather than portraying himself merely as a witness. Shinozuka described participating in experiments, killing prisoners, and disposing of bodies' confessions that implicated himself in war crimes. He expressed remorse and stated that his testimony aimed to ensure future generations understood what had occurred, that the crimes not disappear into historical silence. His confessions, published in Japanese media and presented at international forums, created controversy in Japan, where many still denied or downplayed Unit 731's activities. Some accused him of being a traitor, others questioned his motives or his memory, but his testimony contributed crucial first-hand accounts from perpetrator perspectives. Other former Unit 731 members followed Shinozuka's example. Koshi Sadao, who had worked as a medical assistant, provided detailed accounts of vivisection procedures, the technical steps, the medical instruments used, the observations recorded, the disposal of bodies afterward. His testimony was remarkable for its clinical precision, describing horror in the language of medical procedure, revealing how thoroughly he and his colleagues had been trained to view human suffering through detached, professional frameworks. Yuasa Ken, a military surgeon assigned to Unit 731, described the gradual process by which he and colleagues became desensitized to atrocity, how initial revulsion gave way to clinical detachment, and eventually to participation without conscious moral questioning. Yuasa's testimony was particularly valuable because he articulated the psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary doctors to commit extraordinary evil. His account emphasized that perpetrators were not monsters fundamentally different from other people, but rather ordinary individuals who, placed in specific institutional contexts with particular ideological frameworks and social pressures, made choices that violated their own prior moral standards. Think about what Yuasa described. He arrived at Unit 731 as a trained doctor, someone who had studied medicine to heal. His first exposure to human experimentation shocked him. He felt revulsion, moral distress, awareness that what he was witnessing violated everything he had been taught about medical ethics. But Unit 731's institutional culture normalized these activities. Senior doctors presented experiments as necessary research serving Japan's national defense. Colleagues participated without apparent moral conflict. Refusing to participate would mark him as weak, unpatriotic, unsuited for military medical service. So Yuasa participated, first in minor ways, then more directly. Each step made the next easier. The mind adapts to circumstances, and when those circumstances include daily exposure to atrocity, adaptation can mean the erosion of moral sensitivity. Eventually, Yuasa found himself conducting experiments without the initial revulsion, viewing prisoners as experimental subjects rather than human beings, writing reports that translated suffering into data. Only years later, removed from Unit 731's environment, did he recognize how completely his moral framework had been corrupted. These confessions faced skepticism and hostility in Japan. Some critics accused former perpetrators of exaggerating or fabricating claims to gain attention or sell books. Others argued that elderly individuals might have confused memories or might be influenced by Chinese propaganda. Japanese nationalist groups organized campaigns to discredit witnesses, portraying them as traitors motivated by anti-Japanese sentiment or financial gain. The controversy revealed deep divisions within Japanese society about how to address wartime history. While some Japanese citizens and scholars embraced full accounting of wartime atrocities as necessary for reconciliation and moral education, others resisted acknowledging actions they viewed as bringing shame to the nation. This resistance reflected broader patterns in how societies process difficult histories. The tension between those who believe confronting past crimes strengthens moral character, and those who view such confrontations as damaging national pride and social cohesion. The testimonies from survivors and perpetrators converged with documentary evidence that researchers uncovered in archives. Declassified American documents revealed details of the immunity deal and confirmed that Unit 731 had conducted human experiments on a massive scale. Japanese government documents, some leaked by sympathetic officials, showed that high-level authorities had known about and authorized Unit 731's activities. Photographs taken by Unit 731 personnel and discovered in archives provided visual evidence of the facility and, in some cases, documented specific experiments. The accumulation of survivor testimony, perpetrator confessions, and documentary evidence created an historical record that became increasingly difficult to deny. Each type of evidence reinforced the others. Survivor descriptions matched architectural details visible in photographs. Perpetrator confessions corroborated survivor accounts of specific procedures. Documents confirmed organizational structures and personnel assignments mentioned in testimonies. Together, these sources built a comprehensive picture of Unit 731's operations. Legal challenges emerged as survivors and their families sought justice and compensation. In the 1990s, Chinese survivors filed lawsuits in Japanese courts seeking official government acknowledgement of Unit 731's crimes and financial compensation for suffering endured. These cases faced numerous legal obstacles. Japanese courts often ruled that international treaties ending World War II precluded individual compensation claims, and that statutes of limitation had expired legal technicalities that denied justice on procedural grounds. Despite these legal defeats, the lawsuits served important purposes. They generated media coverage that educated the public about Unit 731. They forced the Japanese government to address Unit 731's official statements, even if those statements remained evasive. They created official records of victim testimony that would otherwise have been lost. The courtroom became a forum where survivors could speak truth to power, where their suffering was formally acknowledged even if legal remedies were denied. The gradual emergence of truth transformed Unit 731 from suppressed secret to established historical fact. Museums opened in China, most notably the Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731 at the original site near Harbin, which opened in 1985 and expanded in subsequent decades. Educational materials, incorporating Unit 731's history, appeared in Chinese schools. International scholars published comprehensive studies, analyzing the facility's operations, its place in Japanese military strategy, and its ethical implications. Documentaries and films brought Unit 731's story to wider audiences, though sensationalized or inaccurate portrayals sometimes complicated efforts to maintain historical accuracy and appropriate sensitivity. Popular media attention created awareness, but also risked reducing complex history to simplified narratives or graphic sensationalism that obscured rather than illuminated. The voices from the shadows survivors who found courage to speak, perpetrators who broke loyalty oaths to confess, journalists who pursued difficult truths, activists who demanded accountability collectively ensured that Unit 731's crimes entered historical consciousness, despite powerful forces working to suppress them. These individuals demonstrated that truth, however uncomfortable and however long suppressed, ultimately possesses a resilience that outlasts official denial. Their testimony honors the victims by ensuring their suffering is acknowledged and remembered. It challenges societies to confront difficult histories rather than burying them beneath convenient amnesia. It affirms that moral accounting, though it may be delayed by decades, remains possible and necessary. The emergence of truth about Unit 731 required extraordinary courage from ordinary people, survivors who relived trauma to testify, perpetrators who faced social ostracism to confess, journalists who persisted despite obstacles, activists who demanded accountability despite official resistance. This gradual revelation process teaches us something profound about historical truth. It cannot be permanently suppressed. Official denials may delay its emergence but cannot prevent it. Documents can be destroyed, but memories persist. Institutions can coordinate silence, but individual conscience eventually rebels. The truth about Unit 731 took decades to emerge fully, but it emerged nonetheless, a testament to the persistent power of truth and the courage of those who speak it. Yet, even now, the full story remains incomplete. Some documents remain classified. Some witnesses died without testifying. Some questions may never receive definitive answers. The next chapter of this story explores those persistent uncertainties, the mysteries that endure despite decades of investigation, the questions that remain unanswered, and what that incompleteness reveals about both historical inquiry and the lasting consequences of official cover-ups. Despite decades of investigation, testimony from survivors and perpetrators, and analysis of declassified documents, fundamental questions about Unit 731 remain incompletely answered. Some uncertainties result from the systematic destruction of evidence, documents burned, buildings demolished, witnesses killed, records falsified. Other ambiguities arise from the complexity of historical reconstruction, where conflicting testimonies, incomplete records, and the passage of time make definitive conclusions elusive. These persistent mysteries reveal the limitations of historical knowledge, particularly regarding events that powerful institutions worked to conceal. They demonstrate that some truths may be permanently obscured, that the full accounting of certain crimes may remain forever incomplete. Yet these unanswered questions themselves tell us something important about Unit 731's legacy and about how power structures attempt to control historical memory. The most basic yet elusive question concerns the death toll. How many people died at Unit 731 and its satellite facilities? This should be a straightforward factual question, a matter of counting victims and documenting deaths. But when perpetrators destroy records and entire institutions work to conceal crimes, even simple counting becomes impossible. Conservative estimates place the number at 3,000 deaths within the main facility near Harbin, based on documented prison capacity, facility operation duration, and testimony about the rate at which prisoners were processed through experiments and killed. But this figure accounts only for the main facility, and only for prisoners held within Unit 731's prison blocks. It excludes deaths at satellite units scattered across occupied territories. It excludes victims of weapons field tests conducted outside the facility. It excludes casualties of biological weapons deployments in Chinese cities. It excludes individuals who died during transport to Unit 731 or immediately after release when they were too damaged to survive. More expansive estimates suggest 10,000 to 20,000 deaths directly attributable to Unit 731 and its network. Some historians argue the total reaches 100,000 or more when including civilians who died from disease outbreaks potentially caused by biological weapons releases. The uncertainty arises from multiple factors. Unit 731 personnel destroyed prisoner records before surrendering, eliminating primary documentation of who was imprisoned and killed. Testimonies from perpetrators vary significantly. some claiming thousands died while others suggesting smaller numbers. Chinese records of missing persons during the occupation are incomplete, and not all disappearances can be definitively linked to Unit 731. The question of how to count indirect deaths, civilians who died in disease outbreaks that might have been caused by deliberate biological attacks, remains methodologically complex and contested. Without definitive documentation, we are left with estimates, ranges, acknowledgement of uncertainty. Think about what this uncertainty means for victims and their families. They cannot even know for certain how many people suffered and died. The imprecision itself becomes an additional injustice, the erasure of identity, the obscuring of scale, the denial of even accurate counting. Each victim was an individual with a name, a life, relationships, aspirations. Reducing them to uncertain statistical ranges seems another form of dehumanization, though unavoidable given destroyed records. Equally uncertain is the extent to which Unit 731's biological weapons were deployed in actual warfare. Evidence clearly establishes that field tests occurred, with prisoners exposed to weapons under controlled conditions to measure effectiveness. But whether large-scale deployment against civilian populations happened remains disputed, a question that matters both for historical accuracy and for understanding the full scope of Unit 731's crimes. The strongest evidence points to several specific incidents. In October 1940, Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs containing plague-infected fleas over Ningbo, a city in Zhejiang province. A plague outbreak followed, killing approximately 100 people according to contemporary records, though some estimates suggest higher casualties. The temporal connection between the aircraft drops and the outbreak, combined with testimony from Unit 731 personnel about conducting such attacks, creates strong circumstantial evidence. Similar attacks allegedly occurred in other Chinese cities, including Chengde in 1941, where a cholera outbreak killed thousands and followed shortly after reports of Japanese aircraft dropping unusual containers. Evidence includes survivor testimony, reports of strange ceramic fragments found after aircraft passes, and the sudden appearance of diseases uncommon in those regions during those seasons. But the ambiguity surrounding these biological attacks stems from multiple complications. First, naturally occurring disease outbreaks were common during wartime, particularly in areas with compromised sanitation, displaced populations, and limited medical care. War creates conditions favorable to disease spread through malnutrition, crowding, infrastructure destruction, and medical system collapse. Distinguishing between natural outbreaks and deliberately caused epidemics requires evidence that may not exist or survive. Second, Japanese military documents that would confirm or deny biological weapons deployment were destroyed. The few surviving records are fragmentary and use ambiguous language that allows multiple interpretations, references to special operations or epidemic prevention activities that might mean biological attacks or might mean other military actions. Third, testimonies conflict. Some Chinese witnesses describe aircraft drops followed by unusual outbreaks. Some former Unit 731 personnel confirm that biological weapons were deployed operationally, but others deny this, claiming that while weapons were developed and tested, they were never used on significant scale. Definitive resolution would require documentation that no longer exists, if it ever did. So we are left with probability rather than certainty, with strong evidence suggesting biological attacks occurred but lacking the documentary proof that would eliminate all doubt. History sometimes offers only incomplete answers, and Unit 731's weapons deployment remains one of those areas where certainty eludes us. Another persistent mystery concerns the fate and utilization of Unit 731's experimental data. Investigators collected approximately 10,000 pages of reports and conducted extensive interviews with Unit 731 personnel. This information went to Fort Detrick, where American biological warfare researchers analyzed it. But what specific knowledge did the Americans extract? How did it influence American biological warfare programs? Did the data actually provide useful insights that couldn't have been obtained through ethical research methods? Some Unit 731 related documents have been declassified and released to researchers over decades. These include interrogation transcripts, summary reports on specific topics like plague transmission or frostbite treatment, and correspondence between American military officials discussing the immunity deal. But significant portions of the documentary record remain classified. The United States government maintains that some information must remain secret for national security reasons, though the specific justification for classifying 75-year-old biological warfare research remains unclear. This ongoing classification fuels suspicions that particularly damning information remains hidden. Perhaps evidence of the extent to which American biological warfare programs incorporated Unit 731's research, or documentation that American authorities had more detailed knowledge of Unit 731's crimes than they acknowledged publicly. The secrecy itself becomes part of the story, demonstrating how governments continue protecting information that might prove embarrassing or complicate official narratives. The involvement of Japanese pharmaceutical companies in Unit 731's research presents another area of unresolved questions. Several major Japanese pharmaceutical firms existed during the 1930s and 40s, and evidence suggests some provided equipment, materials, or technical expertise to Unit 731. After the war, some former Unit 731 personnel joined these companies in prominent positions. Did pharmaceutical companies knowingly support human experimentation? Did they benefit from data obtained through unethical research? If so, have modern pharmaceutical companies that are corporate descendants of these wartime entities acknowledged this history and addressed it? Investigation into pharmaceutical industry connections has revealed suggestive but incomplete evidence. Green Cross Corporation, a major Japanese pharmaceutical company, employed several former Unit 731 members in the post-war period, including some in leadership roles. Documents show that during the war, the company supplied materials to military medical units, though whether this included direct support to Unit 731 remains uncertain. Other pharmaceutical firms show similar patterns: employment of Unit 731 veterans and wartime connections to military medical research. But definitive evidence of knowing complicity or direct financial benefit from unethical research remains elusive. Companies deny wrongdoing or claim insufficient records exist to reconstruct wartime activities fully. This uncertainty leaves uncomfortable questions, unresolved questions about corporate responsibility, about how companies should address problematic histories, about whether modern institutions bear responsibility for their corporate predecessors' actions. The question of Emperor Hirohito's knowledge of and responsibility for Unit 731's activities remains contentious, touching raw nerves in debates about Japanese wartime responsibility. Japanese law and custom prohibited holding the emperor responsible for wartime actions, and American occupation authorities deliberately shielded Hirohito from prosecution to maintain stability during occupation. But did the emperor know Unit 731 existed and understand its activities? Did he authorize or approve biological warfare research? Evidence suggests that high-level approval existed for biological warfare research. Unit 731 consumed significant resources and operated for years as a major military facility. Such an operation required authorization from senior military leadership, and key decisions likely required imperial approval or at least imperial awareness. Some testimony from former military officials claims the emperor was briefed on biological warfare programs, though specific details are disputed. But definitive documentary evidence directly tying Hirohito to Unit 731 has not emerged, leaving his degree of knowledge and responsibility uncertain. This ambiguity partly results from deliberate obscurity wartime. Japan's bureaucratic and military culture often avoided explicit written orders for controversial actions, relying instead on implicit understanding and verbal authorization that left no documentary trail. The emperor's role remains shrouded in this deliberate vagueness, with some arguing he must have known, while others claim he was insulated from such matters by military authorities who operated independently. The post-war careers of Unit 731 personnel raised troubling questions about accountability and complicity, that extend beyond individual cases to systemic issues. Shiro Ishii lived comfortably in Tokyo until 1959, but beyond Ishii, dozens of doctors and researchers who worked at Unit 731 returned to professional careers in medicine, academia, and industry. Some became university department chairs, training new generations of doctors. Others led pharmaceutical research divisions. Several wrote medical textbooks and published academic papers. Did Japanese medical institutions that hired these individuals know about their Unit 731 involvement? If they knew, why was employment offered rather than denied? This question extends to how Japanese medical and scientific establishments addressed their wartime history. Unlike Germany, where denazification programs attempted to exclude Nazi collaborators from post-war professional life, Japan conducted no comparable process for medical war criminals. This absence of accountability meant that individuals who committed or oversaw atrocities could seamlessly transition to respected peacetime careers. Some testimonies suggest that within Japanese medical circles, Unit 731 service was known but tacitly accepted as an unfortunate wartime necessity. This normalization prevented serious reckoning with medical ethics violations and perpetuated cultures of denial that continue influencing Japanese debates about wartime history. The failure to exclude Unit 731 veterans from medical practice represents a systemic ethical failure, demonstrating how institutions can become complicit in concealing crimes through silence and acceptance. The extent of Soviet knowledge about Unit 731 and Soviet biological warfare research presents another set of unknowns. Soviet forces captured some Unit 731 personnel and facilities during their advance through Manchuria. The Khabarovsk trials in 1949 demonstrated Soviet possession of significant information about Unit 731's activities. But did the Soviets obtain experimental data comparable to what Americans collected? Did captured Unit 731 personnel contribute to Soviet biological warfare programs? Evidence suggests Soviet biological warfare programs were extensive, continuing well beyond World War II into the Cold War era. Whether Unit 731 derived knowledge contributed significantly remains uncertain. Soviet authorities kept their biological warfare research highly classified, and the collapse of the Soviet Union revealed only partial information about these programs. Some former Soviet bioweapons scientists have provided testimony suggesting their programs operated largely independently of Japanese research, relying instead on Soviet-developed methodologies. But complete accounting of Soviet biological warfare history remains impossible, with many documents still classified or destroyed. A final persistent mystery concerns whether contemporary medical knowledge incorporates information derived from Unit 731's unethical experiments. Some medical understanding of frostbite treatment, altitude sickness, disease progression, and related topics developed during the same period Unit 731 operated. Did Unit 731 data enter the broader scientific literature in ways that make it impossible to disentangle ethical research from unethical sources? This question parallels debates about Nazi medical experiments research conducted on concentration camp prisoners that produced some data about hypothermia, high-altitude physiology, and other topics. The medical ethics consensus generally holds that such data should not be cited or used, even if potentially useful, because doing so implicitly validates the unethical research and diminishes respect for victims. But applying this principle proves complicated when determining which specific medical knowledge derives from unethical sources, particularly when information may have been incorporated into broader research without clear attribution. The uncertainty reflects deeper tensions about how societies should relate to knowledge obtained through evil means, and whether such knowledge can or should be ethically utilized. These unanswered questions serve multiple purposes in historical understanding. They reveal the limitations of historical reconstruction, particularly regarding events that powerful institutions worked to conceal. They demonstrate how destruction of evidence creates permanent gaps in knowledge that testimony and circumstantial evidence cannot fully close. They show how the passage of time, the death of witnesses, and the classification of documents can place certain historical truths beyond definitive recovery. But perhaps most importantly, these persistent mysteries function as ongoing invitations to deeper inquiry, reminding each generation that the full accounting of Unit 731's crimes remains incomplete, and that the moral obligation to seek truth continues even when complete answers prove elusive. The questions themselves bear witness to crimes that perpetrators attempted to erase, demonstrating that even incomplete knowledge can serve justice by preventing total historical amnesia. We may never know precisely how many died, exactly which cities were attacked with biological weapons, what specific knowledge American and Soviet programs derived from Unit 731, or the full extent of institutional complicity. But we know enough. We know that systematic human experimentation occurred. We know that thousands suffered and died. We know that immunity deals protected perpetrators. We know that official denials suppressed truth for decades. And we know that bearing witness to even incomplete truth honors victims and strengthens our collective commitment to preventing similar atrocities. Unit 731's shadow extends far beyond the years it operated, reaching across decades to touch our present moment. The crimes committed within its walls and the immunity granted to its perpetrators continue shaping debates about medical ethics, war crimes, accountability, biological weapons control, and how societies process difficult histories. Understanding? Unit 731's legacy requires examining its influence across multiple domains, from specific ethical frameworks governing medical research to broader questions about justice, memory, and humanity's capacity for both atrocity and moral progress. The most direct impact appears in medical research ethics. Unit 731 represents an extreme case of medical science conducted without ethical constraints, where the Hippocratic principle of do no harm was completely abandoned and human subjects were treated as experimental materials, rather than individuals with inherent dignity and rights. This history, combined with revelations about Nazi medical experiments and later scandals like the Tuskegee syphilis study, drove the development of research ethics frameworks designed to prevent such abuses. Consider how these frameworks emerged from confrontation with atrocity. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 during trials of Nazi doctors, articulated 10 principles for ethical medical research, with voluntary informed consent as the fundamental requirement. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964 and updated multiple times since, expanded these principles into a comprehensive framework for medical research ethics. Both documents emerged from humanity's confrontation with wartime medical atrocities. While the Nuremberg Code responded primarily to Nazi crimes, knowledge of Unit 731 informed later refinements, as the full scope of Japanese biological warfare research became known in the 1980s and 90s. The principles established informed consent, protection of vulnerable populations, requirement that research benefits outweigh risks directly addressed the violations that Unit 731 exemplified. Modern medical research operates under oversight structures designed to prevent Unit 731-like abuses. Institutional review boards evaluate proposed research involving human subjects, ensuring informed consent, minimizing risk, and protecting vulnerable populations. International ethical guidelines prohibit research that treats human beings as mere means to knowledge, rather than as individuals whose dignity must be respected. These safeguards arose directly from historical recognition that without external constraints and transparent oversight, research can violate basic human rights, and that institutional pressures, nationalist ideology, or scientific ambition can lead individuals to commit acts they would recognize as evil under normal circumstances. Unit 731 taught us that ethical constraints cannot be optional or internally enforced. They must be external, systematic, and backed by real consequences for violations. Yet ethical challenges persist in ways that echo Unit 731's legacy. Dual-use research scientific work with both beneficial and potentially harmful applications presents ongoing dilemmas. Research on dangerous pathogens to develop treatments or vaccines also generates knowledge applicable to biological weapons development. gain-of-function research that makes viruses more transmissible or virulent in laboratory settings aims to understand pandemic threats, but could potentially create them. Synthetic biology enables creation of novel organisms with beneficial uses, but also raises bioterrorism concerns. These contemporary scientific practices operate in the shadow of Unit 731, with debates about acceptable risk, appropriate oversight, and where to draw lines between legitimate research and dangerous knowledge, explicitly referencing historical cases where scientific curiosity divorced from ethical constraints led to atrocity. Think about these parallels. Modern researchers studying dangerous pathogens face questions Unit 730. Aeon's history makes urgent. How do we balance knowledge that could save lives against risks of misuse? What safeguards prevent research from crossing ethical boundaries? Who decides when scientific knowledge becomes too dangerous to pursue? Unit 731 demonstrated conclusively that good intentions and professional credentials do not prevent ethical violations, that without robust external oversight, research can drift toward practices that violate fundamental human rights. Unit 731's legacy shaped international biological weapons control efforts profoundly. The Biological Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1975, prohibits development, production, and stockpiling of biological and toxin weapons. 183 nations have ratified the treaty, representing near-universal acknowledgement that biological weapons are inherently unacceptable. This prohibition emerged from recognition of biological weapons' unique dangers. They are difficult to control once released, can cause massive civilian casualties, and violate fundamental norms distinguishing combatants from non-combatants. Unit 731's weapons development and the deployment incidents in China demonstrated these dangers concretely, providing historical evidence that biological warfare threatens not just military targets, but civilian populations on vast scales. But the Biological Weapons Convention faces significant limitations that Unit 731's history illuminates. Unlike chemical weapons treaties, it lacks robust verification mechanisms to confirm compliance. Nations can maintain defensive biological weapons research programs that potentially provide cover for offensive work. Advances in biotechnology make biological weapons increasingly accessible to smaller nations and non-state actors. The treaty relies primarily on voluntary compliance and transparency, with limited enforcement options when violations are suspected. These weaknesses reflect tensions between scientific freedom, national, security interests, and non-proliferation goals, tensions that Unit 731's history reveals but doesn't resolve. How do we distinguish between legitimate defensive research and weapons development? How do we verify compliance without intruding on legitimate scientific work? How do we enforce prohibitions when violations occur? Unit 731 demonstrated that biological weapons can be developed and deployed in secret, that international agreements can be circumvented, that nations pursuing perceived strategic advantages may ignore ethical and legal constraints. Within Japan, Unit 731 remains a contested element of historical memory, a wound that has never fully healed. The Japanese government has officially acknowledged that Unit 731 existed and conducted experiments, but specifics of that acknowledgement remain limited and carefully worded. Debates continue about textbook coverage, with some Japanese textbooks providing detailed Unit 731 history, while others mention it minimally or omit it entirely. These variations reflect broader divisions within Japanese society about how to address wartime history between those who view full accounting of atrocities as necessary for reconciliation and moral education versus those who resist narratives they perceive as excessively critical of Japan or damaging to national pride. This tension manifests in ongoing controversies over war memorials, museums, school curricula, and official government statements about wartime conduct. This historical memory debate has diplomatic implications that extend beyond Japan's borders. China regularly criticizes Japan for insufficient acknowledgement of wartime atrocities, including Unit 731. These criticisms reflect genuine grievances but also serve strategic purposes in ongoing geopolitical tensions. The issue of historical memory becomes intertwined with territorial disputes, economic competition, and regional influence, complicating efforts at historical reconciliation. South Korea, similarly, criticizes Japanese historical narratives, particularly regarding comfort women and forced labor, creating regional patterns where wartime history remains contentious decades after the events. These ongoing tensions demonstrate how unresolved historical questions continue influencing contemporary international relations, how the past remains present in disputes ostensibly about current issues. The Unit 731 site near Harbin functions as a physical site of memory where these tensions manifest. The museum presents comprehensive documentation of Unit 731's crimes from a Chinese perspective, emphasizing Japanese aggression and Chinese suffering. Japanese visitors to the museum report varied responses, some expressing shock at learning details never taught in Japanese schools, others questioning the presentation's objectivity or feeling unfairly blamed for crimes committed generations ago. These reactions reveal how historical sites can both educate and polarize, serving simultaneously as tools for truth-telling and as spaces where national grievances are performed and reinforced. Museums like this perform crucial functions, preserving evidence, honoring victims, educating visitors, but they also become contested spaces where different nations' historical narratives collide. The immunity deal's legacy creates ongoing moral questions about justice deferred and compromised. Survivors and victims' families who sought accountability through Japanese courts largely failed to obtain formal recognition or compensation. The legal precedent established by granting Unit 731 personnel immunity that strategic interests can override war crimes, prosecution has been invoked in subsequent situations where powerful nations faced decisions about whether to prosecute military or intelligence personnel accused of serious crimes. Consider what this precedent means. It suggests that justice is negotiable, that accountability depends not on the severity of crimes, but on whether perpetrators possess valuable information or serve powerful interests. This principle undermines international law, damages faith in justice systems, and communicates to victims that their suffering matters less than strategic calculations made by powerful nations. Yet the gradual emergence of truth demonstrates that historical justice operates on timescales beyond legal prosecution. While Shiro Ishii and most Unit 731 personnel died before facing formal accountability, their crimes entered historical record and their reputations stand condemned by history. The truth that the Japanese government and American authorities worked to suppress eventually emerged through the persistent work of survivors, journalists, historians, and conscience-driven former perpetrators. This process of truth emergence, though slower than formal justice, establishes moral accountability that transcends legal mechanisms. History itself becomes a court rendering judgment that, while lacking power to punish, establishes permanent record of crimes and responsibility. This historical accountability may seem insufficient compared to criminal trials and imprisonment, but it serves essential purposes, ensuring crimes are not forgotten, honoring victims by acknowledging their suffering, and creating precedents that influence how future generations understand ethical boundaries. Unit 731's history raises profound questions about human nature and moral behavior that extend beyond this specific case. How do ordinary people, doctors trained to heal, scientists committed to knowledge, administrators managing institutions come to participate in systematic atrocity? The testimonies of former Unit 731 personnel provide insights into this process. Gradual involvement that incrementally desensitizes, institutional contexts that normalize evil, ideological frameworks that dehumanize victims, social pressures that punish dissent, hierarchical structures that diffuse individual responsibility, and rationalization mechanisms that reframe atrocity as necessary, scientific, or patriotic. Understanding these psychological and social mechanisms serves preventive purposes, recognizing warning signs and structural conditions that enable atrocity allows societies to resist such patterns when they begin emerging. Unit 731 warns that medical and scientific establishments, despite their stated commitments to human welfare and knowledge advancement, can be corrupted when institutional pressures, nationalist ideology, or perceived necessity override ethical constraints. The lesson extends beyond historical analysis to contemporary vigilance. Modern instances of research ethics violations, while generally far less extreme than Unit 731, reveal that the temptation to prioritize scientific goals or institutional interests over individual rights persists. Continued vigilance, robust oversight mechanisms, and cultures that empower individuals to raise ethical concerns remain necessary, precisely because Unit 731's history demonstrates that ordinary institutional and social dynamics, under specific conditions, can produce extraordinary evil. For medical professionals, Unit 731 serves as a defining case study of the profession's potential for corruption. Medical schools and ethics training programs reference Unit 731 when teaching about research ethics, human subjects, protection, and professional responsibility. The case illustrates that medical knowledge and skill can be weaponized, that the healer's art can be perverted into instruments of torture, and that professional expertise carries moral obligations that transcend institutional loyalty or national interest. These lessons aim to cultivate ethical awareness that helps medical professionals navigate contemporary dilemmas and recognize when institutional pressures or situational factors might be leading them toward ethical compromise. The education emphasizes that each generation of medical professionals inherits responsibility to maintain ethical standards, to resist institutional pressures that conflict with patient welfare, and to prioritize human dignity over institutional interests or career advancement. The unanswered questions surrounding Unit 731 death toll uncertainties, extent of biological weapons deployment, degree of institutional complicity, whereabouts of classified documents function not as failures but as ongoing invitations to deeper inquiry. Each generation of researchers returns to Unit 731's history, discovering new evidence, interviewing surviving witnesses while any remain, analyzing declassified documents, and refining understanding. This continuing investigation demonstrates that historical truth-seeking remains active rather than static. The past continuously yields new insights as perspectives shift, evidence emerges, and analytical frameworks evolve. The persistence of inquiry honors victims by ensuring their stories remain alive in historical consciousness, by refusing to let these crimes disappear into historical silence despite powerful forces that worked toward that erasure. Unit 731's legacy ultimately centers on bearing witness. The victims who suffered and died in its laboratories cannot be restored to life. The justice denied them cannot be retroactively provided, but ensuring their suffering is remembered, their humanity acknowledged, and the crimes committed against them thoroughly documented serves purposes of historical justice that transcend legal prosecution. Bearing witness honors victims by refusing to let their experiences disappear into historical silence. It educates present and future generations about the consequences of ethical failure. It strengthens collective moral immunity against similar atrocities by demonstrating concretely where unconstrained institutions and corrupted professions can lead. The act of remembering becomes itself a form of resistance against the forces of denial and forgetting that perpetrators mobilize to conceal their crimes. The story of Unit 731, from its origins in military ambition and nationalist ideology, through its operation as a facility of systematic horror, to the immunity deal that allowed perpetrators to escape justice, to the gradual emergence of truth despite suppression, to its lasting influence on medical ethics and biological weapons control, reveals fundamental truths about human capability for both evil and moral progress. That such an institution could exist, operate for years, and employ thousands demonstrates humanity's capacity for systematic atrocity. That survivors found voice, perpetrators confessed, investigators persisted, and truth eventually emerged demonstrates humanity's capacity for confronting difficult histories and seeking accountability despite obstacles. That ethical frameworks were strengthened, international treaties were established, and oversight mechanisms were created in response demonstrates humanity's capacity to learn from historical failures and construct institutional safeguards against their repetition. Yet, Unit 731's legacy also warns against complacency, the persistence of biological weapons programs, the ongoing challenges of dual-use research, the recurring instances of research ethics violations, and the continued diplomatic tensions over historical acknowledgement reveal that the lessons of Unit 731 remain incompletely learned. Each generation inherits the responsibility to understand this history, confront its implications, and ensure that the conditions enabling such atrocities, institutional cultures that prioritize goals over ethics, ideological frameworks that dehumanize others, authority structures that diffuse individual moral responsibility, and secrecy that prevents accountability, are recognized and resisted when they begin emerging. The echoes of Unit 731 reverberate through time, carried in medical ethics codes, international treaties, historical debates, and collective memory. These echoes remind us that human progress toward justice and ethical conduct is neither automatic nor permanent, that vigilance remains necessary, that bearing witness to historical atrocities serves present purposes, and that the fullest accounting of difficult histories remains an ongoing obligation rather than a completed task. In remembering Unit 731, we honor the thousands who suffered and died. We acknowledge the incomplete justice that followed. We commit to preventing similar atrocities through strengthened ethical frameworks, international cooperation, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And we accept that the hardest questions about human behavior, institutional responsibility, and moral accountability often resist simple answers, but demand our continued attention nonetheless. The fortress in Manchuria stands as monument and warning. Its concrete walls witness to what occurred within them. The museum preserves evidence and honors victims. The ongoing debates about historical acknowledgement demonstrate that this history remains contested, incomplete, urgent. As we stand at this historical moment, looking back across 8 decades to Unit 731's crimes and forward to uncertain futures where biotechnology creates new ethical challenges, we carry responsibility to remember, to learn, to bear witness, and to ensure that the lessons purchased through such suffering inform our choices and strengthen our commitment to human dignity. The story of Unit 731 is not safely historical. It remains present in every debate about research ethics, in every discussion of biological weapons control, in every tension over historical memory, in every moment when institutions pressure individuals to compromise ethical principles for perceived greater goods. Understanding this history equips us to recognize and resist similar patterns in our own contexts, to maintain vigilance about the fragility of ethical constraints, and to remember that the boundary between healing and harming, between science and atrocity, between civilization and barbarism, remains thinner than we might wish, requiring constant maintenance, eternal vigilance, and the courage to speak truth even when power structures prefer silence. This is the legacy of Unit 731, a warning written in concrete and bone, in destroyed documents and surviving testimony, in crimes concealed and gradually revealed. It speaks across time, asking each generation, will you remember? Will you learn? Will you resist when similar patterns emerge? The answers we give through our choices and actions determine whether this history serves as cautionary tale or merely as chronicle of suffering that taught us nothing. The voices of victims, survivors, and truth-tellers who refuse to let this history disappear call us to choose remembrance, learning, and vigilance to ensure that bearing witness to past atrocities strengthens our commitment to preventing future ones.